I found out my brother was stealing from my inheritance, so I made him regret it forever. I always thought my brother Jake had my back. You know, growing up, he was my protector, the guy who taught me how to ride a bike and let me borrow his CDs back in the day. But recently, I discovered something that completely shattered my trust, and honestly, it made me question if I ever really knew him at all. Turns out, Jake had been sneaking behind my back for years, siphoning away something incredibly important. My inheritance. But don't worry, I didn't just let it slide. What happened next? Let's just say, I made sure Jake regretted it forever. Buckle up, because this story is a wild ride with one shocking twist after another. Part 1. The suspicious phone call. This all started about 6 months ago when I got a call from my late aunt's lawyer. My aunt, Lydia, was one of the coolest people in my life. She was eccentric, lived on a huge plot of land with a dozen rescue dogs, and always talked about leaving her estate to me and Jake. She never had kids of her own, so growing up, we were like her surrogate children. Anyway, the lawyer told me they were finalizing the paperwork for her estate, and they just needed to confirm a few details with me. Weird, right? I thought everything was already sorted out, but I didn't think too much of it. Just gave them the info they asked for and moved on with my day. A couple of days later, I mentioned the call to Jake when we were grabbing coffee. He froze. Like mid-sip, cup hovering in the air kind of froze. "Oh yeah," he said after an awkward pause. I already talked to them about that. They must have called you by mistake." It felt off, but I let it go. Jake was the executor of Aunt Lydia's estate, which made sense since he was older and way more organized than me. I figured he had everything under control. But as I walked to my car that day, I couldn't shake this gut feeling that something wasn't adding up. Why would the lawyer need to call me if Jake had it all handled? I decided to let it slide for the moment, but little did I know, that call was just the tip of the iceberg. Part 2. Unanswered questions. After that coffee meetup, I started noticing small things that didn't sit right. Jake was acting weird. Not in a he's hiding something big way yet, but enough to make me curious. He'd dodge my questions about the estate or brush them off with vague answers. Then, there were the changes in his lifestyle. Jake's always been pretty chill when it comes to money. He drives an old truck, wears the same sneakers until they fall apart, and usually skips out on vacations to save cash. But suddenly, he was posting Instagram stories from high-end restaurants and talking about a big project he was working on. At first, I told myself he'd probably just gotten a raise at work. Or maybe he'd finally hit it big with those stocks he'd been obsessed with. But one night, while scrolling through my own sad dinner of microwaved lasagna, I saw a photo he posted. It was him, holding a glass of wine, standing next to a car. A brand new Audi. Okay, that was officially weird. Jake didn't even like flashy cars. And wasn't he just complaining last month about having to replace his water heater? Where was all this money coming from? That's when I decided to start digging. I wasn't trying to be shady. I just wanted to understand what was going on. Maybe there was a simple explanation, and I was just being paranoid. The first thing I did was call Aunt Lydia's lawyer back. I asked him point blank if Jake had already settled the estate. The lawyer hesitated. "Well," he said carefully, "your brother has been managing things, but there are still some loose ends we're working on." "Why do you ask?" I didn't want to tip Jake off yet, so I just played it cool and said I was curious. But now, I was more suspicious than ever. And trust me, I was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. Part 3. A secret meeting. After that phone call with the lawyer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something shady was happening. But I also knew I couldn't just accuse Jake outright, not without proof. So I decided to bide my time and gather information. A couple of weeks later, the lawyer called me again. This time he sounded almost nervous, which immediately put me on edge. "Hey," he said, "I don't usually do this, but I thought you should know. There's a meeting scheduled for next week to finalize some details about your aunt's estate. Your brother asked us not to bother you with it, but..." He trailed off, like he didn't want to finish that sentence. "Wait, what?" Jake asked them not to tell me? That was a massive red flag. "I'll be there," I said firmly, cutting him off before he could backpedal. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning at the lawyer's office. I made sure to show up early, dressed in my best "I'm a serious adult" outfit, because I wanted them to take me seriously. Jake showed up about 10 minutes later, looking surprised, and not in a good way. when he saw me sitting there. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. I just smiled and said, "Thought I'd check in, since this is about Aunt Lydia's estate and all." Jake didn't argue, but I could tell he was rattled. He sat down across from me, fidgeting with his phone while we waited for the lawyer to start. The meeting itself was interesting. Most of it was standard legal stuff, but there was one moment that stood out like a flashing neon sign. The lawyer mentioned a distribution of funds and casually asked if I'd received my share yet. My share? What share? Jake jumped in before I could say anything, laughing nervously. "Oh yeah, we've been working on that. Just waiting on a couple more things to clear." That was a flat-out lie, and I knew it, but I didn't call him out. Not yet. Instead, I played along, pretending like everything was fine. Inside, though, I was boiling. Jake was clearly hiding something, and now I was determined to find out what. Part 4. The Paper Trail. After the meeting, I couldn't shake how Jake had lied so smoothly in front of the lawyer. If he was bold enough to do that in a professional setting, who knew what else he'd been up to? That night, I stayed up late, doing a deep dive into everything I could find about Aunt Lydia's estate. I dug through old emails, text messages, and even a shoebox of random papers she'd left me years ago. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I figured if Jake was hiding something, there had to be a trail somewhere. And boy, was I right. Tucked away in my email archives was a message from Aunt Lydia, sent about a year before she passed. In it, she mentioned a trust she had set up for me and Jake. She said she wanted us to have equal shares of her estate so we could each build the lives we've always dreamed of. At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. She was always saying stuff like that. But now, the words equal shares jumped out at me. If we were supposed to get equal shares, why did the lawyer think I'd already been paid? And why was Jake living it up while I was still driving my beat-up old Civic and eating ramen 3 nights a week? I needed answers, so I decided to confront Jake directly. But first, I wanted to be prepared. The next morning, I called the lawyer again and asked if there was any way I could see the financial records for Aunt Lydia's estate. He hesitated, saying it would normally be up to the executor, aka Jake, to share that information. But when I hinted that I was worried about possible irregularities, he agreed to send me a summary of the accounts. When the email came through, my heart sank. According to the records, a huge chunk of the estate, nearly half, had been withdrawn shortly after Lydia's will was executed. The money had been transferred to a bank account I didn't recognize. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but at that point, it was pretty obvious what had happened. Jake had taken my share of the inheritance and was pretending it didn't exist. I was furious, but I knew I had to play this smart. If Jake thought he could steal from me and get away with it, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Part 5. Confrontation. Armed with the financial records from the lawyer, I decided it was time to confront Jake. But instead of storming in guns blazing, I took a different approach. I wanted to catch him off guard, so I invited him over for dinner at my place. Jake showed up that evening with a 6-pack of beer, acting like everything was completely normal. He even joked about how I still hadn't upgraded my furniture. "You should really treat yourself," he said, sinking into my lumpy couch like he hadn't just stolen tens of thousands of dollars from me. I forced a smile and played along, but inside, I was seething. After dinner, I casually brought up Aunt Lydia. "It's crazy to think she's been gone for over a year now," I said. "I still miss her like crazy." Jake nodded, suddenly looking a little uncomfortable. "Yeah, me too. She was one of a kind." "She really was," I said, leaning forward slightly. I've been thinking a lot about her estate lately. It's weird, but I don't really remember seeing much from my share. Do you know anything about that?" Jake froze for a split second, just long enough for me to catch it, before he quickly recovered. Yeah, the estate stuff. It's complicated. You know how lawyers are. Takes forever to sort everything out." I didn't let him off the hook. "Funny you say that," I replied, pulling out my phone, "because I talked to the lawyer last week, and he sent me some records. Want to take a look?" Jake's face went pale. "What do you mean, records?" he asked, his voice tight. I opened the email and slid my phone across the table. "This," I said, pointing to the suspicious withdrawal. "It's weird. This account doesn't look familiar to me. Does it to you?" For a moment, Jake just stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he muttered, "Look, it's not what you think. Then what is it, Jake? I snapped, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you stole my inheritance. He didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he launched into this long-winded explanation about how he'd been in a tough spot financially and borrowed the money to pay off some debts. I was going to pay you back, he insisted. I just needed time. Time? I repeated, laughing bitterly. Jake, you've had over a year, and all you've done is buy a fancy car and live like a king while I've been scraping by. Do you have any idea how messed up this is? He looked genuinely ashamed, but at that moment, I didn't care. The trust I'd had in him was completely shattered. You'd better figure out a way to fix this, I told him, because if you don't, I'm not just going to let this slide. Jake left that night looking like he'd just been hit by a truck. But as far as I was concerned, he deserved every bit of guilt he was feeling. Little did I know, though, this confrontation was only the beginning. Part 6. The Backup Plan. After Jake left, I spent the rest of the night alternating between anger and disbelief. How could he do this to me? To us? Aunt Lydia trusted him to handle everything fairly, and he just threw that trust out the window for his own selfish gain. The next morning, I called the lawyer again. I explained everything. Jake's confession, the missing money, and my suspicions that he had no intention of paying me back. The lawyer listened carefully, then let out a long sigh. Well, this definitely complicates things, he said. Unfortunately, since Jake is the executor, he has a lot of control over how the estate is managed. But if he's misappropriated funds, you might have grounds to take legal action. Legal action? The thought hadn't even crossed my mind yet, but now that he said it, it made perfect sense. Jake clearly wasn't going to fix this on his own, so I needed to force his hand. The lawyer recommended a forensic accountant, a specialist who could go through the financial records with a fine-tooth comb and figure out exactly where all the money had gone. It wasn't cheap, but I decided it was worth every penny. If Jake thought he could just sweep this under the rug, he was in for a rude awakening. While the accountant got to work, I started documenting everything. I saved emails, text messages, and even screenshots of Jake's Instagram posts where he showed off his new car and fancy dinners. I wasn't sure if I'd need it all, but I wanted to be ready for anything. A week later, the accountant called me with an update. I've gone through the records and there's no doubt about it. Your brother funneled a significant portion of the estate's funds into his personal accounts, he said. It looks like he started transferring money almost immediately after the will was executed. Hearing it confirmed by a professional made my blood boil all over again. Jake hadn't just made a mistake. He'd planned this. He'd chosen to steal from me, knowing full well what he was doing. The accountant offered to help me prepare a detailed report to present to the lawyer. He said it would make a strong case if I decided to pursue legal action, which, at this point, was looking like my only option. But before I filed anything, I decided to give Jake one last chance to make things right. If he refused, then I'd bring the full weight of the law down on him. Part 7. The Ultimatum. With the forensic accountant's report in hand, I called Jake and asked him to meet me for coffee. He sounded hesitant, but agreed, probably thinking I was going to let bygones be bygones. Spoiler alert, I wasn't. When he walked into the cafe, I could tell he was nervous. He greeted me with a forced smile and tried to make small talk, but I wasn't in the mood. I got straight to the point. I talked to a forensic accountant, I said, sliding a copy of the report across the table. This shows exactly how much money you took and where it went. Care to explain? Jake's face turned ashen. He stared at the papers like they were a ticking time bomb. I told you, I was going to pay you back, he said weakly. I just needed more time. You've had over a year, I shot back. And let's be honest, Jake, you weren't planning to pay me back, were you? You thought I'd never find out. He didn't say anything, which was all the confirmation I needed. I'm giving you one last chance, I continued. You pay me back every cent you owe me, or I take this to court. And trust me, if it comes to that, you won't just lose the money, you'll ruin your reputation, your career, everything. Jake swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting with the coffee cup in front of him. I don't have all the money anymore, he admitted quietly. Some of it went to pay off debts, and the rest, well, it's gone. Gone, I repeated, my voice rising. What the hell does that even mean? He mumbled something about bad investments and not thinking things through, but at that point, I'd heard enough. Figure it out, Jake, I said, standing up. Sell the car, take out a loan, do whatever you have to do. but if I don't see progress in the next 2 weeks, I'm filing a lawsuit. He looked completely defeated as I walked out of the cafe, but I didn't feel sorry for him. He'd brought this on himself, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. Over the next 2 weeks, I waited to see if Jake would follow through. He sold the car, which was a start, but it barely made a dent in what he owed me. When I pressed him for more, he started dodging my calls and making excuses again. That's when I knew he wasn't going to take me seriously until I took real action. Part 8. Legal Fallout. When the 2 weeks passed with no real progress from Jake, I decided enough was enough. I called the lawyer and told him I wanted to move forward with legal action. He explained the process. We'd file a formal complaint against Jake for breaching his fiduciary duty as the executor of the estate. It sounded complicated and honestly a little intimidating, but I was determined to see it through. Jake had underestimated me for too long, and I wasn't about to let him get away with this. The lawyer helped me draft the complaint, and within a few days, we filed it with the court. When Jake was served with the papers, he called me in a panic. "Are you serious right now?" he yelled. "You're really going to take this to court? Do you have any idea what this could do to me?" "Oh, you mean like what stealing my inheritance has done to me?" I shot back. "Yeah, Jake, I'm serious. Maybe you should have thought about the consequences before you decided to screw me over." He tried to guilt trip me, talking about how stressful his life had been and how he'd made one little mistake. But I wasn't buying it. Taking a few $100 would have been a mistake. Taking half the estate and blowing it on cars and bad investments? That was a calculated decision. As the case moved forward, things got messy. Jake's lawyer tried to argue that he'd acted in good faith and hadn't meant to harm anyone, but the forensic accountant's report completely dismantled that argument. The records showed exactly how much money he'd taken and where it had gone, and the judge didn't look too impressed with Jake's excuses. By the time we got to the settlement phase, it was clear Jake didn't have much of a leg to stand on. He ended up agreeing to a repayment plan, which would force him to pay back every cent he owed me, plus interest. It wasn't the instant karma I'd hoped for, but it was a win nonetheless. And the best part? The judge also removed Jake as the executor of the estate, which meant he wouldn't be able to pull any more stunts like this. Part 9. The Fallout at Home. After the legal case was settled, things between Jake and me were, well, let's just say strained would be an understatement. He tried to act like the whole thing was just a bump in the road, but I wasn't interested in playing nice. The rest of the family found out pretty quickly, and the reactions were mixed. My parents were devastated. They'd always seen Jake as the responsible one, so finding out what he'd done shattered their image of him. My mom cried when I told her everything, and my dad just shook his head and muttered, "I never thought he'd do something like this." Other relatives were less sympathetic. One of our cousins, who'd always had a bit of a grudge against Jake for being the golden child, took every opportunity to throw shade at him. "Guess being the favorite doesn't mean you're perfect, huh?" she said at a family barbecue, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jake, for his part, mostly kept to himself after that. He still had to follow the repayment plan, which meant selling off a lot of his stuff and living on a tight budget. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a tiny bit of satisfaction every time I saw him driving around in an old beat-up car instead of his shiny Audi. But even with the legal case behind us, the betrayal still stung. Jake and I had been close growing up, and I'd always looked up to him. Knowing that he'd chosen money over our relationship made it hard to imagine ever trusting him again. One night, months after everything had gone down, Jake called me out of the blue. "Look," he said, his voice heavy. "I know I can't undo what I did, and I know you probably hate me, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. For real this time." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe him, but another part of me couldn't forget how easily he'd lied to my face before. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, "but it's going to take time, Jake. You don't just come back from something like this overnight." "I know," he said quietly. "I just hope someday you'll be able to forgive me." Whether or not that day ever comes, I'm still not sure. Part 10. Moving Forward. After everything settled down, I started to focus on rebuilding my life, and more importantly, making sure nothing like this ever happened again. Jake's betrayal had taught me a harsh but valuable lesson about trust, family, and money. The repayment plan meant I eventually got back what was owed to me, though it took years for the full amount to come through. By the time the final payment hit my account, I'd already moved on in a lot of ways. I'd used some of the earlier payments to invest in myself, taking courses, upgrading my car, and finally moving out of my cramped apartment into a place that felt like home. As for Jake, he stayed on the fringes of my life. We'd see each other at family events, but our conversations were polite and superficial. He'd lost the respect of most of the family, and while some people eventually forgave him, others kept their distance. I think he realized that repairing those relationships would be a lifelong process, not something he could fix with a few apologies. Over time, I stopped feeling angry and started feeling, I don't know, maybe pity. Jake had always been the kind of person who seemed to have it all together, but I realized he was just as flawed as anyone else, maybe more so. His actions had cost him more than money. They'd cost him trust, relationships, and a lot of the privilege he'd taken for granted. Looking back, I'm proud of how I handled things. I stood up for myself, fought for what was rightfully mine, and didn't let him get away with taking advantage of me. If nothing else, this whole mess taught me to be more vigilant about my own finances and to never let someone else have full control over something that impacts my life so deeply. And to anyone watching this who might be dealing with a similar situation, here's my advice. Don't let fear or guilt stop you from standing up for yourself. Family can be complicated, but that doesn't mean you have to tolerate being mistreated. So, what do you think? Was I too harsh on Jake, or did he get what he deserved? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've ever dealt with family drama like this, share your story too. Sometimes, the best way to heal is to know you're not alone. Underscore, 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 underscore. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more wild tales like this one, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. What do you think about what happened? Was I too hard on Jake, or did he deserve it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear your take on this. And if you've ever had to deal with family drama, betrayals, or inheritance disputes, tell your story in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going. Thanks for watching, and remember, stand up for yourself, protect what's yours, and never let anyone, family or not, take advantage of you. See you in the next one.